On Christmas Eve, a millionaire finds a dirty note stuck to the gutter, written by his own daughter. As he reads, "I want a new dad," the luxurious world around him silently crumbles. Torn between $1 million deal and the chance to be a real father, he faces the most difficult decision of his life. But what he does next changes not only his destiny, but that of everyone around him. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. Richard Blackwood checked his Rolex as the elevator ascended to the 65th floor of the gleaming Chicago skyscraper that housed Blackwood Capital Partners. At 46, Richard had transformed a modest financial consultancy into one of the Midwest's most formidable investment firms. The glass-walled conference room offered a panoramic view of the city he'd conquered, with Lake Michigan shimmering in the distance. The Preston portfolio analysis is ready for your review, and the board is expecting your decision on the Seattle acquisition by Friday, his assistant Jennifer said as she placed a leather portfolio on the mahogany table. "And Mrs. Blackwood called to remind you about the charity gala this Saturday," Jennifer added before stepping out. Richard nodded absently. Cassandra, his partner of 4 years, managed their social calendar with precision. She had moved into his Lincoln Park mansion shortly after they began dating, taking on the role of stepmother to his son Ethan, whose mother had relocated to Europe for a fresh start when the boy was just 3. The morning proceeded with military efficiency until Gregory Winters, his senior partner, raised an unexpected concern. "The Meridian merger is hitting roadblocks, Richard. Their legal team found inconsistencies in the projections." Richard frowned. "That's impossible. I've verified those numbers myself. They're requesting an emergency meeting tomorrow. Tomorrow. I promised Ethan I'd be at his science fair." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what Gregory was implying. In their world, personal commitments were subordinate to 9-figure deals. "Reschedule for Thursday," Richard said firmly, ignoring the surprised expressions. "My son comes first this time." The meeting continued, but something about the Meridian figures troubled Richard. By 3 o'clock, he made an unusual decision. "I need to review these at home. Cancel my remaining appointments." As his driver navigated through downtown Chicago traffic, Richard loosened his tie and stared at the passing cityscape. Leaving early felt foreign to him. In 15 years, he'd rarely departed the office before 8. The Blackwood residence stood proud among the historic mansions of Lincoln Park, a 3-story brownstone renovated to Richard's exacting standards. As his key turned in the lock, the silence struck him immediately. No housekeeper preparing dinner, no sound of Ethan's video games or piano practice. "Hello?" His voice echoed through the marble foyer. Richard checked his watch. Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, had Wednesdays off, he remembered, and Cassandra was probably at her weekly spa appointment. But Ethan should be home from school by now. Moving through the quiet house, an unfamiliar instinct guided him toward the kitchen. He heard it before seeing anything, soft, muffled sobbing that stopped him cold in the doorway. There, hunched over the kitchen trash can, was 8-year-old Ethan. The boy's small hands, dirty from digging through garbage, clutched a piece of hardened bread. His private school uniform was immaculate. Cassandra insisted on appearances, but his face was streaked with tears. "Ethan?" Richard whispered, his voice barely audible through the shock. The boy's head snapped up, eyes wide with terror. In a panicked motion, he tried to hide the salvaged food behind his back. "I'm sorry," Ethan stammered, backing away until he hit the refrigerator. "I was really hungry, Dad, really hungry." Richard crossed the kitchen and knelt before his son. "Why are you looking for food in the trash?" "Where's Cassandra?" Ethan's lower lip trembled. "She's out shopping. She left after I got home from school." "Didn't she give you a snack? Lunch?" The boy's eyes darted away. Richard gently placed his hands on Ethan's shoulders, feeling the boy's thin frame beneath the expensive fabric. "You can tell me, son. You won't get in trouble." After a moment's hesitation, the words tumbled out in a rush. "She never gives me food when you're not home. She says I eat too much and make a mess." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes I'm so hungry it hurts, Dad." Something broke inside Richard, a shattering so profound he felt it physically. The pristine kitchen, with its wolf range and sub-zero refrigerator stocked with gourmet ingredients, suddenly seemed obscene against his son's hunger. "How long has this been happening?" Richard asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Since she moved in." Ethan looked down at the bread crust still clutched in his small hand. "Mrs. Wilson at school sometimes gives me extra food at lunch. She knows." The cafeteria supervisor knew his son was starving at home, but he, Richard Blackwood, financial mastermind and father, had noticed nothing. "Come here," Richard said, opening his arms. Ethan hesitated, then stepped forward. When Richard embraced him, he felt the boy's initial stiffness, as if physical affection was as unfamiliar as regular meals. Richard stood up, lifting Ethan with him, and carried him to the refrigerator. Setting the boy on the counter, he opened both doors wide. "You can have anything you want. Everything you want." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" Richard began pulling out ingredients: bread, turkey, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes. "I'll make you a proper sandwich. Then we'll have dinner. Whatever you'd like." As Richard assembled the sandwich, he noticed Ethan watching his every move with a mixture of hunger and suspicion. When he handed the plate to his son, Ethan snatched it and began devouring the food so quickly Richard feared he might choke. "Slow down, buddy. There's plenty more. No one will take it away." Ethan nodded but continued eating rapidly, turning his body slightly as if to shield the food from potential thieves. The protective gesture told Richard everything about his son's daily reality. The front door opened and closed. The sound of heels clicked across the marble foyer. Richard's jaw tightened as Cassandra's voice called out, "Richard, is that you home early?" She appeared in the doorway, elegant in designer clothing, shopping bags dangling from her wrists. Her perfect features registered surprise at the domestic scene before her. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone light but eyes narrowing at the mess on the counter. "I was just about to order dinner." Richard's gaze met hers, and something in his expression made her shopping bags lower slowly to the floor. "Ethan," he said without looking away from Cassandra, "would you go upstairs to your room for a few minutes? Take your sandwich. I need to talk to Cassandra privately." The boy slid off the counter, clutching his plate. At the doorway he paused, looking back at his father with an expression that mingled hope with fear, the face of a child who didn't dare believe that rescue had finally arrived. As Ethan's footsteps receded up the stairs, Richard turned fully toward the woman he had welcomed into their lives. In her eyes he saw not confusion or remorse, but calculation. She already knew exactly what he had discovered. "I found my son digging through garbage for food," he said, each word precise and measured. "In a house full of food, with a platinum card at your disposal for anything he needs." Cassandra's perfectly manicured hand reached for her phone, a reflexive action. "He's being dramatic, Richard. You know how children exaggerate. Don't." The single word stopped her cold. "Don't insult my intelligence with lies. Vamos continuar com o segundo capítulo." Richard watched as Cassandra's practiced composure briefly faltered. She set her phone on the kitchen island, her long fingernails tapping against the marble surface. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice measured. "Ethan had lunch at school. I was planning to order dinner." "He's fine. He was eating from the garbage," Richard replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "Look me in the eye and tell me this is the first time." Cassandra's gaze flickered, a momentary betrayal of guilt before her eyes hardened with defiance. "Children can be manipulative, Richard. You're barely home. You don't understand how difficult he can be." The calculated cruelty of her defense made Richard's blood run cold. He'd spent years negotiating with the most ruthless business minds in Chicago, but never had he encountered such callous disregard for an innocent child's well-being. "I want the truth," he demanded, closing the distance between them. "How long has this been going on?" Cassandra's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of victimhood. "You're choosing to believe an 8-year-old over me. After everything I've done for this family, what exactly have you done for my son, Cassandra, besides starving him when I'm not looking?" Her facade finally cracked. "Fine, you want the truth? I never asked to be a mother. I never wanted kids. But you came with baggage, and I accepted that." "Baggage?" Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're talking about my son. I make sure he looks presentable at your business functions. I coordinate with his school. I maintain our social standing. But I'm not his servant, Richard." I'm not going to spend my days making peanut butter sandwiches and cleaning up his messes. Every word revealed the stranger standing before him. 4 years together, and he'd never seen beyond the polished exterior to the emptiness within. How had he been so blind? "Get out," Richard said, his voice steady despite the rage boiling inside him. Cassandra laughed, a brittle sound. "Don't be ridiculous. You need me. Who's going to look after Ethan while you're building your empire? Who's going to host your clients and organize your charity? Events, you can't do this alone, Richard." Her words struck a vulnerable chord. It was true. He delegated Ethan's care to a succession of nannies, housekeepers, and finally to Cassandra. Always too busy, always another meeting, another deal. "I'll manage," he said with more conviction than he felt. "Pack your things and leave. Tonight." Cassandra's confidence wavered as she realized he was serious. "You're making a mistake. Call me when you come to your senses." She gathered her shopping bags, her movements rigid with indignation. "And don't blame me when your precious company starts to suffer because you're playing Mr. Mom." She turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, Ethan has a dentist appointment tomorrow at 4, and he needs to bring cupcakes for some school thing on Friday. Good luck with all that." After the front door slammed, Richard stood motionless in the kitchen, the enormity of what had happened and what would come next washing over him. He had no idea how to be a full-time parent. He barely knew his son's daily routine. Slowly he climbed the stairs to Ethan's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see his son sitting on the edge of his bed, still holding the half-eaten sandwich, as if afraid it might be his last meal. The sight splintered Richard's heart anew. He knocked gently. "Can I come in, buddy?" Ethan nodded, his eyes wary. Richard sat beside him, noticing for the first time how the boy shifted slightly away, maintaining a careful distance. Had his own son always been this guarded around him? "Cassandra is going to be staying somewhere else from now on," Richard said carefully. Ethan looked up, his expression a complex mixture of hope and disbelief. "Forever? Yes. Because of me," fear edged into his voice. "No, son. Because of her. Because of the choices she made." Richard hesitated, then added, "And because of the choices I made. I haven't been the father you deserve." Ethan studied his sandwich, absorbing this. Who's going to take care of me now? The simple question carried the weight of years of neglect. Not just Cassandra's, but his own. "I am," Richard said, the 2 words a vow. Ethan's dubious expression spoke volumes. "But you're always working." "Things are going to change around here." Richard reached out slowly and placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Starting tonight." That evening became a crash course in parenting. Richard discovered that he didn't know what time Ethan usually went to bed, what his homework routine was, or even where his pajamas were kept. Each question he had to ask his son was another indictment of his absentee fatherhood. While Ethan showered, Richard called the office. "Jennifer, I need you to clear my schedule tomorrow." "Family emergency. But sir, the Meridian meeting, tell Gregory to handle it, and have my calendar sent to my email. I need to review everything." After hanging up, he stood in the doorway of Ethan's room, watching his son climb into bed. The walls were decorated with space posters and shelves lined with books Richard had never seen his son read. A stranger's room in many ways. "Dad?" Ethan asked as Richard tucked him in. "Are you really going to stay home tomorrow?" "All day," Richard promised. "Cassandra always says you're too important to miss work." "Nothing is more important than you." The words came easily because they were true, though Richard was ashamed it had taken him so long to realize it. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Richard sat in his home office reviewing his calendar with growing horror. 3 months of appointments stretched before him, days packed from dawn until evening. Board meetings, investor lunches, international calls. Where was the time for school drop-offs, for homework help, for the simple act of making dinner? He opened his laptop and began drafting an email to his executive team, outlining necessary changes to his schedule. As he typed, his phone lit up with a message from Gregory. "Heard about your family emergency. Hope everything's okay. Reminder, Q3 projections due Friday. Board concerned about your recent distractions." Richard stared at the message, the subtle warning clear. He'd built Blackwood Capital on his reputation for unwavering commitment. In 15 years, he'd never put family before business. Now in a single day, he was upending those priorities. His partners wouldn't understand. Investors might get nervous. The market was unforgiving of perceived weakness. He set the phone aside and continued writing his email. Whatever came next, he would face it. But first he needed to become the father Ethan had always needed. The next morning brought its own challenges. Richard woke early, determined to prepare breakfast before Ethan got up, only to discover the refrigerator contained little suitable for a child: imported cheeses, prosciutto champagne, but no milk, no cereal, not even bread for toast. While Ethan slept, he made a quick trip to the grocery store, returning with bags full of kid-friendly food. By the time his son appeared in the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Richard had pancakes cooking on the stove. "You're really still here," Ethan said, his voice filled with wonder. "I told you I would be." Richard flipped a pancake with more confidence than skill. "What time do you need to be at school?" 8:15, but Cassandra usually leaves at 7:30 because she likes to get coffee first. The casual revelation of another small cruelty, making a child arrive unnecessarily early to accommodate an adult's coffee habit, reinforced Richard's resolve. "Well, today we'll leave at the right time, and I'll pick you up after school too." Ethan's eyes widened. "You're picking me up?" "Yes, and we'll go to your science fair together." But what about your important meetings? Cassandra always said you can't miss those, even for special days." Richard set a plate of pancakes in front of Ethan. "It turns out, spending time with you is the most important meeting I have today." As they ate breakfast together, perhaps their first in years, Richard learned more about his son in 30 minutes than he had in months. Ethan's favorite subject was science. He had a best friend named Miguel. He was being bullied by a fifth grader named Derek. Each revelation was precious and painful, a glimpse into a life Richard had been too busy to witness. After dropping Ethan at school, Richard returned home and spread his work across the dining room table. He could manage both, he told himself, be present for Ethan and keep the company running. It would require discipline and efficiency, but those were his strengths. His phone buzzed constantly, emails, texts, calls from the office. Each time he felt the pull of his old life, the urgency of deals and decisions. By noon his resolve was already being tested. When he arrived at Ethan's school for pickup, his phone rang again. Gregory's name flashed on the screen. Richard hesitated, then silenced the call as he spotted Ethan emerging from the building. The smile that broke across his son's face when he saw Richard waiting was worth more than any deal. That afternoon, as they prepared Ethan's science project together, Richard's phone continued its insistent buzzing. Eventually, he turned it off completely. The world of Blackwood Capital could wait. Today belonged to Ethan. As night fell and Richard tucked his son into bed for the second night in a row, a record in recent memory, Ethan looked up at him with serious eyes. "Is it going to be like this tomorrow too?" he asked quietly. Richard hesitated. Tomorrow was the rescheduled Meridian meeting. The Seattle acquisition needed his attention. The board was already questioning his commitment. "I'll try," he said truthfully. "I can't promise every day will be like this, but I promise I'll be here every morning and every night. And I promise you'll never go hungry again." Ethan nodded, seeming to understand both what was said and what wasn't. "That's okay. I know you have to work, but I also have to be your dad," Richard said firmly. "And from now on, that comes first." After Ethan fell asleep, Richard turned his phone back on. 27 missed calls, 43 unread emails, 3 increasingly urgent texts from Gregory. The outside world was demanding his return. He sat in the dimly lit hallway outside Ethan's room, scrolling through the messages. A familiar pressure built in his chest, the weight of expectations, the fear of losing everything he'd built. But when he glanced back at his sleeping son, a different kind of fear took precedence. The fear of losing something, far more precious than any business empire. Continuando com o terceiro capítulo. Media type text markdown by. The end of the first week without Cassandra, Richard had developed a newfound respect for single parents. Every morning was a military operation, preparing breakfast, packing lunch, finding missing socks, and getting Ethan to school on time. Every evening brought homework battles, dinner dilemmas, and the constant struggle to be present despite the relentless demands of his company. He'd returned to the office but insisted on a modified schedule. No meetings before 9 a.m. or after 4 p.m. This unprecedented, boundary setting sent ripples through Blackwood Capital. Executive assistants scrambled to reschedule. Partners exchanged concerned glances in hallways. Clients were told Mr. Blackwood was restructuring his availability to optimize productivity. On Friday afternoon, Richard sat in his office reviewing quarterly projections when Gregory knocked on his door. "Got a minute?" Gregory's usual confident demeanor seemed strained. "Just one. I'm picking up Ethan at 3:30, Richard replied, glancing at his watch. Gregory closed the door behind him. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss. The board is concerned, Richard. This new schedule of yours, it's raising questions." "What questions?" "About your commitment. Your focus." Gregory leaned forward. "Look, we all understand you're going through some personal changes, but the Meridian deal is wobbling because you weren't at yesterday's meeting. The Seattle acquisition needs your direct attention. Investors are asking why you've suddenly gone part-time." "Part-time?" Richard's eyebrows rose. "I'm working 60 hours instead of 90. That's hardly part-time. You know what I mean. This isn't the Richard Blackwood who built this company." Gregory's expression softened slightly. "Whatever's happening at home, hire someone. Get another nanny. But you can't keep putting personal matters ahead of Blackwood Capital." The words struck a nerve precisely because, a week ago, Richard would have said the exact same thing. He'd built his identity around being the man who never flinched, never faltered, and never put anything before business. "My son was being neglected under my own roof while I was here building this company," Richard said quietly. "I'm not making that mistake again." Noble sentiment. Gregory's tone suggested otherwise. "But this isn't just about you anymore. There are shareholders, employees, partners who depend on your leadership. The Richard I know wouldn't let them down." After Gregory left, Richard sat motionless, his friend's words echoing in his mind. Was he being selfish? Irresponsible? The Richard Blackwood of 2 weeks ago would certainly think so. That man had believed success was measured in deals closed, assets managed, empires built. But the image of Ethan digging through garbage for food had shattered that certainty forever. As promised, Richard left at 3:15 to pick up his son. While waiting outside the school, he checked his phone to find 3 missed calls from the Meridian team and an email from the board requesting an emergency meeting, tomorrow, Saturday. "Dad." Ethan's voice cut through his thoughts. The boy was running toward him, backpack bouncing, a paper clutched in his hand. "I got an A on my science project." Richard pocketed his phone and knelt to embrace his son, feeling the small arms wrap around his neck with increasing confidence. Each day Ethan grew a little less guarded, a little more trusting. "That's amazing. Let's celebrate. How about ice cream?" Ethan's eyes widened. "On a Friday. Cassandra said treats were only for weekends when you're home." "Well, I'm changing the rules," Richard said, taking his son's hand as they walked to the car. "Ice cream is definitely allowed on Fridays when you get an A." At the ice cream parlor, Richard watched Ethan carefully selecting toppings with deliberate concentration. These small pleasures had been denied him for so long that even choosing between sprinkles and chocolate chips seemed momentous. "Dad?" Ethan asked as they sat at a small table by the window. "Is your work mad at you?" Richard paused mid-bite. "What makes you ask that?" "La news she... I heard you on the phone last night. You sounded worried." Ethan swirled his spoon through melting ice cream. "Cassandra always said your company would fall apart if you spent too much time with me." The casual cruelty of those words, spoken to a child, about his own father, reignited Richard's anger toward Cassandra. But more painful was the realization that his son had internalized the message. Spending time with him was a liability. "My company is not going to fall apart," Richard assured him. "And even if it did, you're more important." Ethan looked skeptical. "But you love your work." "I do," Richard admitted, "but I love you more." "I just forgot that for a while." That night, after Ethan was asleep, Richard sat at his desk preparing for the emergency board meeting. The agenda was clear even if unspoken. His recent behavior was threatening investor confidence. He needed to demonstrate his unwavering commitment to Blackwood Capital. But as he reviewed spreadsheets and presentations, a new question formed in his mind. What exactly was he fighting to preserve? The company, certainly. The livelihoods of his employees. the legacy he'd built. But at what cost? Looking back, he could barely remember Ethan's birthdays or school events. He'd been physically present for pictures and formalities, but mentally always elsewhere, calculating risks, planning strategies, anticipating market movements. His phone buzzed with a text from Gregory. "Hope you're ready for tomorrow. Board wants reassurance. Bring your A-game." Richard set the phone aside and walked to Ethan's room. The boy slept peacefully, his science project certificate displayed proudly on his nightstand. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to simply watch his son breathe, to appreciate the miracle of this small person he'd helped create, but barely knew. In that moment, his resolve crystallized. He would fight to keep his company, but not at the expense of his son. Never again. The next morning, Richard hired a babysitter, a college student named Zoe, whom Mrs. Wilson from Ethan's school had recommended. She arrived with a backpack full of board games and books. "Ethan's had breakfast," Richard explained as he gathered his materials for the meeting. "He can watch 2 hours of TV maximum. If I'm not back by lunch, there's food in the fridge. My number is on the counter if you need anything." Ethan watched this exchange with interest. "Are you going to work on a Saturday?" "Just for a meeting," Richard assured him. "I'll be back for lunch and then maybe we could go to the park." Ethan nodded, but his expression was guarded, the look of a child who had learned not to count on promises. The Blackwood Capital boardroom was unusually full for a Saturday. All 7 board members were present, along with Gregory and the chief financial officer. Richard recognized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a tribunal. Eleanor Woodward, the board chairperson, began without preamble. "Richard, we've asked you here because there are concerns about recent changes in your level of engagement with the company." "I'm fully engaged," Richard replied calmly. "I've simply adjusted my schedule to accommodate family responsibilities. These adjustments coincide with the Meridian deal stalling and the Seattle acquisition timeline slipping," said Walter Preston, the oldest board member. "2 weeks ago you were personally driving both projects. Now suddenly you're leaving at 3:30 and delegating critical decisions. My teams are more than capable." "Blackwood Capital wasn't built on capable teams," Gregory interjected. "It was built on your personal commitment, your availability to clients 24/7, your willingness to sacrifice everything else for this company's success." The accusation hung in the air. Richard looked around the room at the faces of people who had known him for years, some for decades. They were not cruel people. They simply couldn't understand the transformation he was undergoing, because they had never seen Ethan's small hands digging through garbage for food. "Things have changed," Richard said simply. "That's precisely our concern," Eleanor replied. "The question is whether these changes are temporary or permanent." Richard understood the implicit ultimatum. He was being asked to choose, return to his former all-consuming dedication to work, or face potential consequences to his position and authority. "I appreciate everyone coming in today," he began carefully. "Blackwood Capital has been my life's work. I've given it 15 years of 16-hour days, missed holidays, cancelled vacations." He paused. "But recent events have forced me to reevaluate my priorities." The room tensed. Walter shook his head slightly as if sensing what was coming. "My son needs me," Richard continued. "Not just financially, but physically present. I've neglected that responsibility for too long, and I won't continue to do so." "No one is suggesting you neglect your son," Eleanor said diplomatically. "But surely there are arrangements that could be made, a nanny, a housekeeper, that would allow you to maintain your leadership role here without compromise." "I tried that approach," Richard replied. "I outsourced parenting while I focused on business. The result was a child so neglected he was digging through trash for food in a house full of food." This blunt statement created a ripple of uncomfortable shifting in seats. Gregory looked down at his hands. "That's unfortunate," Walter said after an awkward pause. "But with better hiring—" "It wasn't a hiring failure," Richard interrupted. "It was my failure, as a father, as a human being. And I won't repeat it." He straightened in his chair. "I can be an excellent CEO while also being present for my son. It will require changes to how we operate, yes. But those changes are non-negotiable for me." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her tone measured. "The board needs to discuss this privately, Richard. We value your contributions immensely, but we also have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders." She glanced at her colleagues. "Could you give us the room for a few minutes?" Richard nodded and stepped outside. In the hallway, he checked his phone. A text from Zoe. "Ethan is doing great. We're playing chess and he's actually beating me." Attached was a photo of his son, brow furrowed in concentration over a chessboard. Richard hadn't even known Ethan could play chess. Another detail of his son's life he had missed. 20 minutes later, Eleanor opened the door. "We'd like you to come back in." The atmosphere in the boardroom had shifted. Walter looked disgruntled, but the others wore expressions of cautious acceptance. "Richard," Eleanor began, "after discussion, the board acknowledges your personal situation requires accommodation. We're prepared to support modified working hours and increased delegation of certain responsibilities." She paused. "However, we need assurances that key client relationships and major deals will continue to receive your direct attention." It was a compromise, not everything he wanted, but not an ultimatum either. Richard recognized the concession for what it was. "I can commit to that," he said, "with the understanding that my evenings and weekends belong to my son, barring true emergencies." Walter harumphed but remained silent. Gregory looked relieved that open conflict had been avoided. "We'll revisit this arrangement after the Meridian deal closes," Eleanor concluded, "to ensure it's working for all parties." As the meeting adjourned, Gregory approached Richard. "That was close," he murmured. "Walter was pushing for a vote of no confidence. Would you have supported it?" Richard asked directly. Gregory hesitated, his ambition momentarily visible behind his concerned expression. "I'm glad it didn't come to that." The non-answer was answer enough. Richard made a mental note to watch his back, not just with the board, but with his oldest friend and partner. He arrived home to find Ethan and Zoe engaged in what appeared to be their third chess match. Judging by the score sheet beside them, "Dad, I won 2 games!" Ethan exclaimed, his face alight with pride and excitement. "That's amazing. When did you learn to play chess?" "Mrs. Wilson teaches us at lunch sometimes." Ethan reset the pieces. "Can you play too?" Richard glanced at his phone. 3 new emails had arrived during the drive home, all marked urgent. The old Richard would have excused himself immediately, retreated to his office and worked through the weekend. Instead, he set the phone face down on the counter. "I'd love to play, but I should warn you, I was chess champion at my high school." Ethan grinned, a flash of competitive spirit that Richard recognized from his own reflection. "That's okay. I'll still beat you." As they settled in for their match, Richard felt a strange new sensation, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where he belonged. The emails could wait. The board's concerns could wait. For now, there was just a father and son, hunched over a chessboard on a sunny Saturday afternoon, making up for lost time move by careful move. Vamos para o quarto capítulo. Autumn settled over Chicago, painting Lincoln Park in amber and crimson. As leaves fell outside the Blackwood residence, inside, a fragile new rhythm was taking hold. Richard and Ethan developed morning rituals. Breakfast together at the kitchen island, backpack checks and a walk to the car with impromptu science quizzes or jokes. Evenings brought homework at the dining table, cooking experiments that sometimes ended in takeout, and bedtime stories that stretched longer each night. At Blackwood Capital, Richard maintained his modified schedule, despite occasional resistance. He became ruthlessly efficient, eliminating unnecessary meetings and delegating effectively. Most days he made it home for dinner, though there were still nights when conference calls stretched past Ethan's bedtime, leaving apologetic notes on the boy's pillow. By late October, a month after the incident that had changed everything, Richard noticed subtle shifts in Ethan. The boy no longer flinched when Richard opened the refrigerator. He asked for seconds at dinner without hesitation. His backpack wasn't perpetually stuffed with hidden snacks, emergency rations for a child who had learned to expect hunger, small victories that broke Richard's heart all over again. One Wednesday evening, as they washed dishes together after dinner, Ethan asked the question Richard had been dreading. "Dad, is Cassandra ever coming back?" Richard set down the plate he was drying. "No, buddy. That chapter of our lives is over." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful as he handed Richard another dish. Good, I didn't like being hungry all the time. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity or drama, was a stark reminder of how normalized deprivation had become in his son's young life. Ethan, I'm so sorry, I didn't know what was happening, Richard said, setting down the towel and kneeling to his son's eye level. I should have paid more attention. Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with his father's intensity. It's okay. You were busy making money. The casual equation between his absence and making money revealed how Ethan had interpreted years of missed dinners and bedtimes, not as necessary work or building security, but simply accumulating wealth that surrounded him in their luxurious home but hadn't protected him from neglect. Being busy isn't a good excuse for not taking care of you, Richard said firmly. No amount of money is worth what happened. Ethan seemed to consider this, then offered a tentative smile. At least now you're home more, and I get to eat whenever I want. Whenever you want, Richard confirmed, ruffling his son's hair. That's the new house rule. Later that night, Richard received a text from Gregory. Meridian team needs answers on restructuring proposal. Board meeting moved up to Monday. Preston asking questions about your involvement. The undercurrent was clear. The honeymoon period the board had granted him was ending. They expected Richard Blackwood, the full-time, fully committed CEO, back at the helm. Richard sighed, setting his phone aside and walking to Ethan's doorway. The boy slept peacefully, his science fair certificate now joined by a spelling bee award and a soccer team photo on his wall, evidence of a life blooming under proper care and attention. The next morning, Richard dropped Ethan at school and headed to the office earlier than usual. He wanted to get ahead of the Meridian situation before it became another board confrontation. As he walked through the glass doors of Blackwood Capital, the familiar energy of the trading floor welcomed him. Despite everything, he still loved this world he'd built. The pulse of markets, the chess-like strategy of investments, the satisfaction of growing wealth from ideas. Jennifer met him with a coffee and a stack of reports. The Meridian team is waiting in conference room A. Gregory asked to see you before you join them. Richard nodded, making his way to Gregory's corner office. Through the glass walls he could see his partner on the phone, gesturing emphatically. When Gregory noticed Richard, he quickly ended his call. Richard, didn't expect you this early. Gregory's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Thought you'd be doing the school run. Already done, Richard replied, taking a seat. Jennifer said you wanted to see me. Gregory leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the privacy of his office. I wanted to give you a heads up. Walter's been talking to the other board members. He thinks your domestic situation is affecting the Meridian deal. The Meridian deal is proceeding exactly as planned, Richard countered. The restructuring proposal addresses all their concerns about valuation. Yes, but they're asking for you personally. They want the Richard Blackwood who closes deals over weekend golf and midnight scotch, not the one who leaves at 4 to make dinner for an 8-year-old. The dismissive way Gregory referred to Richard's parenting sent a flare of anger through him. My son has a name. It's Ethan. Gregory had the grace to look slightly abashed. Of course, look, I'm on your side here. I'm just telling you what's being said behind closed doors. He hesitated. There's something else. Walter suggested bringing in a co-CEO. A what? Richard sat up straighter. Someone to handle the client-facing aspects, the travel, the after-hours networking. You'd maintain strategic oversight, but be pushed upstairs to a ceremonial role, Richard finished. That's not happening, Gregory. It might not be your choice. Walter has been reaching out to major shareholders. Gregory's expression turned sympathetic, though Richard detected something else beneath it. Anticipation, perhaps. Just thought you should know before Monday's board meeting. As Richard left Gregory's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that his oldest friend in business might not be as supportive as he claimed. There had always been ambition behind Gregory's bonhomie, a hunger for recognition that had been useful when channeled toward building Blackwood Capital, but might become dangerous if directed at undermining Richard's position. The meeting with the Meridian team went smoothly, despite Gregory's warnings. Richard's command of the details impressed even the most skeptical members, and by the end, they had a clear path forward. No midnight scotch required. As he wrapped up, his phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. Ethan not feeling well. School nurse called. Fever of 101, should I pick him up? Richard glanced at his watch. 2 more meetings scheduled, including one with a potential major investor. In his old life, he would have asked Zoe to handle everything, perhaps checking in via text later. I'll get him, he typed back. Be there in 20 minutes. He found Jennifer and quickly rearranged his schedule. I need to reschedule the Harrison meeting. My son is sick, Jennifer nodded, already typing. I'll push it to tomorrow morning. And the Seattle call? See if Gregory can take it. Otherwise, reschedule for tomorrow afternoon. As Richard gathered his things, he noticed curious glances from his team. The old Richard Blackwood, leaving in the middle of the day for a child's fever? Unheard of. When he arrived at Ethan's school, he found his son curled up on a cot in the nurse's office, face flushed and miserable. Dad? Ethan croaked, surprise evident even through his discomfort. You came? The question, and the disbelief behind it, was another indictment of Richard's past priorities. How many times had Ethan been sick before, waiting for a father who never arrived? Of course I came, Richard said, gathering his son and his backpack. Let's get you home. The rest of the day dissolved into cool washcloths, children's Tylenol and Disney movies on the living room sofa. Richard cancelled his remaining calls, sending Gregory a brief text. Handling family emergency. We'll review Seattle materials tonight. The response came quickly. Board won't be happy. Harrison was interested in significant investment. Richard ignored it, focusing instead on Ethan's climbing temperature. By evening, the fever had reached 103, and Ethan's breathing seemed labored. I think we should go to the emergency room, Richard decided, his own heart racing with worry. At Northwestern Memorial, they were quickly ushered into an examination room. The doctor diagnosed influenza, prescribing antivirals and rest. As they waited for the prescription, Ethan dozed against Richard's shoulder, his small body radiating heat. Richard's phone vibrated constantly in his pocket, emails, texts, voicemails, the outside world demanding attention. But the weight of his son against him, trusting, vulnerable, anchored him to what mattered. They arrived home past midnight. Richard settled Ethan in his bed, administered the first dose of medication, and finally checked his messages. 27 emails. 8 missed calls from Gregory alone. A terse note from Walter. Understand family comes first, but Harrison investment potentially crucial for Q4. Expect full briefing tomorrow. The implied criticism stung, but as Richard looked at Ethan sleeping fitfully, fever still flushing his cheeks, he couldn't imagine having made any other choice. He spent the night in an armchair beside Ethan's bed, waking every few hours to check his temperature and administer medication. By morning, the fever had broken, leaving Ethan weak but improving. You stayed all night? Ethan asked groggily, noticing his father's rumpled clothes and the blanket draped across the chair. All night, Richard confirmed, brushing hair from his son's forehead. How are you feeling? Better. Ethan's eyes drifted to Richard's phone on the nightstand. Don't you have to go to work? I'm working from home today. Someone needs to make sure you drink your fluids and take your medicine. Ethan's expression brightened momentarily, then clouded with worry. But won't your company get mad? The question revealed how keenly Ethan had observed the tension between Richard's work and his newfound commitment to fatherhood. Children missed nothing. Let me worry about that, Richard said, squeezing his son's hand. You just focus on getting better. Throughout the day, Richard alternated between caring for Ethan and handling urgent work matters from his laptop. He rescheduled the Harrison meeting again, fielded concerned calls from Gregory, and prepared his strategy for Monday's board meeting, all while keeping soup warm and monitoring Ethan's temperature. By evening, Ethan was well enough to sit up and play chess. As they reset the board for a second game, Richard's phone rang with Walter's direct line, a rare occurrence that signaled the gravity of the situation. I should take this, Richard told Ethan apologetically. It's an important call from work. Ethan nodded with the resigned acceptance of a child used to coming second. It's okay. I understand. But as Richard reached for the phone, he saw the disappointment in his son's eyes, a look he'd probably missed countless times before because he hadn't been paying attention. The phone continued ringing. Walter wouldn't be calling unless it was significant. The Harrison investment. The board concerns. his future at Blackwood Capital potentially hanging in the balance. Richard pressed the decline button. "Actually," he said, returning to the chessboard, "it can wait. This game is more important." The surprise and joy that transformed Ethan's face in that moment was worth more than any deal Richard had ever closed. For perhaps the first time, his son truly believed he was his father's priority. Later, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Richard listened to Walter's voicemail. The board chairman had called to inform him that Gregory had met with the Harrison team in Richard's absence and secured a tentative investment agreement. The tone suggested this should be received as good news, but the subtext was clear. Gregory had stepped into the void Richard had left, demonstrating his value to the company. Richard sat in his darkened home office, contemplating the chess game unfolding at Blackwood Capital. Gregory's moves were becoming clearer, positioning himself as the dedicated alternative to Richard's distracted leadership. The partner who could maintain the firm's standards while the founder attended to personal matters. It was a smart strategy, one Richard himself might have employed in Gregory's position, but understanding the game didn't make it any less dangerous to his control of the company he had built. His phone lit up with a text from Jennifer. "Board meeting agenda for Monday includes leadership structure review, thought you should know." The warning was explicit. Monday's meeting would be about more than the Meridian deal or the Harrison investment. It would be about Richard's future at Blackwood Capital. He closed his laptop and walked to Ethan's room, checking that the boy was sleeping peacefully. The fever had broken completely, his breathing even and deep. Relief washed over Richard, followed by clarity. If the board wanted to discuss leadership structure, he would be ready, not with compromises or half-measures, but with a vision for Blackwood Capital that made room for both ambition and humanity. They had built a successful company, yes, but at what cost? Perhaps it was time to redefine success itself. With that resolve, Richard returned to his office and began preparing for Monday's confrontation. Whatever happened, he would not sacrifice Ethan's well-being again. Not for Blackwood Capital, not for the board, not for anything. Vamos para o quinto capítulo. Monday morning arrived with a crystalline autumn chill. Richard adjusted his tie in the mirror, the familiar ritual now carrying unfamiliar weight. Today could determine not only his professional future, but also his ability to keep the promises he'd made to Ethan. Ethan, still recovering from his illness, sat at the kitchen counter watching his father prepare for battle. "You look serious," the boy observed, spooning cereal into his mouth. "Is it a big meeting day?" Richard smiled, trying to mask his tension. "It's an important one, but I'll be home for dinner no matter what." "Promise?" Ethan asked, his voice small but direct. "Promise." Richard ruffled his son's hair. "Mrs. Peterson will be here all day since you're staying home from school. I've already told her you're allowed unlimited screen time as long as you drink your fluids." Ethan's eyes widened at this unprecedented freedom. "Unlimited, really?" "Well, maybe not unlimited," Richard amended with a laugh, "but extra, because you're recovering." As Richard drove downtown, the Chicago skyline reflected the morning sun, glass and steel gleaming like the empire he'd built. 8 weeks ago, he would have approached today's meeting with single-minded determination to maintain control at any cost. Now his calculations included variables that couldn't be quantified on spreadsheets: a son's trust, a promise kept, a life balanced. Jennifer met him at the elevator, her expression tense. "They're already in there." "Gregory arrived an hour early and has been meeting with the board privately." Richard nodded, unsurprised. "Thank you for the heads up on the agenda item. Anything else I should know?" "Just that Walter seemed particularly confident this morning." She lowered her voice. "And I overheard Gregory on the phone with Harrison yesterday. They have another meeting scheduled, without you." The pieces were moving into position. Gregory's ambition, Walter's dissatisfaction with Richard's new priorities, and the convenient appearance of a major investor who might prefer Gregory's undivided attention to Richard's family-focused approach. The boardroom fell silent as Richard entered. 9 faces turned toward him, some concerned, others calculating, a few openly hostile. Gregory sat at Walter's right hand instead of his usual place at Richard's side. A symbolic repositioning that spoke volumes. "Richard, thank you for joining us," Walter began, his tone suggesting Richard was late rather than precisely on time. We have several matters to discuss today, but perhaps most pressing is the question of leadership structure moving forward. Direct and unambiguous. Walter wasn't wasting time on pretense. "Before we begin," Richard said, taking his seat at the head of the table, "I'd like to thank Gregory for stepping in with the Harrison team last week while I was handling a family emergency." Gregory nodded, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Happy to help. Mark Harrison and I actually go way back. We were at Wharton together." He responded well to the personal touch. The implication was clear. Gregory had connections Richard couldn't match, especially with his divided attention. "Let's get to the point," Walter continued. "The board has been monitoring the situation since our last discussion. While we appreciate your personal circumstances, Richard, the reality is that Blackwood Capital requires leadership that is fully present." Eleanor, who had advocated for Richard before, interjected more diplomatically. "What Walter means is that we're concerned about sustainability. Your current arrangement puts tremendous pressure on you to be in two places at once. Which is why," Gregory added smoothly, "we've been discussing a potential co-leadership model. You would remain as chairman and chief strategist, focusing on the big picture vision you've always excelled at. I would step into a more operational role as president and CEO, handling day-to-day management and client relationships." The proposal was framed as a compromise, but amounted to a demotion. Chairman and chief strategist were impressive titles that often signaled a founder being gently moved aside. Richard would keep his board seat and public recognition while surrendering actual control. "I see," Richard said evenly, betraying none of the anger or betrayal he felt. "And this discussion has progressed to what point?" Walter cleared his throat. "We haven't made any decisions, of course. This meeting is about gathering your thoughts. But I should mention that we've consulted with our major shareholders, and the initial response has been favorable." Translation: they had already secured the votes needed if this came to a showdown. Richard looked around the table, noting who met his eyes and who didn't. Martha Wellington, the only woman on the board besides Eleanor, seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings. James Chen, usually Richard's ally, looked torn. The others were following Walter's lead, with Gregory positioned as the solution to the problem Richard's parenting responsibilities had created. "Before you continue," Richard said calmly, "I'd like to share some thoughts of my own." He opened his portfolio and distributed documents to each board member. "What you're holding is a comprehensive analysis of our performance over the past 6 weeks, since I modified my schedule to accommodate family responsibilities. You'll note that despite predictions of disaster, our key metrics remain strong. The Meridian deal is back on track. The Seattle acquisition is proceeding according to timeline. And the Harrison investment, thanks to Gregory's excellent work, is moving forward." He paused, allowing them to scan the numbers. "In short, the company is thriving despite, or perhaps because of, my more balanced approach to leadership." Walter frowned. "Numbers can be made to tell many stories, Richard. The concern isn't current performance, but future sustainability." "Your divided focus is not divided at all," Richard interrupted firmly. "It's expanded. For 15 years, I poured everything into Blackwood Capital at the expense of everything else. The result was professional success and personal failure. My son was neglected under my own roof while I built this company." He looked directly at Walter. "That neglect culminated in a moment 8 weeks ago when I found my 8-year-old son digging through garbage for food because the woman I'd entrusted with his care was starving him when I wasn't home." The blunt statement dropped into the boardroom like a stone, creating ripples of discomfort. Several board members shifted in their seats. Martha Wellington's hand went to her throat in horror. "My God," she murmured. "Richard, I had no idea." "Few people did," Richard acknowledged, "because I wasn't present enough to see what was happening in my own home. That changes now." Gregory, momentarily thrown by the personal revelation, recovered quickly. "We're all deeply sorry about your family situation, Richard. No one is suggesting you shouldn't care for your son. But Blackwood Capital is responsible to shareholders, clients, and hundreds of employees. We can't base major leadership decisions on one person's domestic arrangements." "I agree," Richard said, surprising them, "which is why I'm proposing something different than either maintaining the status quo or accepting demotion." Distributed a second document. This is a proposal for comprehensive workplace flexibility. At Blackwood Capital, starting at the top with me, but extending throughout the organization. Modified schedules for parents and caregivers, remote work options, results-focused evaluation rather than FaceTime requirements. Walter scoffed. This isn't some Silicon Valley startup, Richard. We're managing billions in assets. Markets don't close for soccer practice. They don't, Richard agreed. But our analysis shows that 43% of our workforce has caregiving responsibilities. Children, aging parents, partners with health issues. We're losing talent and institutional knowledge because we force people to choose between work and family. I'm proposing we stop asking them to make that choice. Eleanor studied the proposal with interest. You're suggesting this would improve retention and productivity? The data supports it, Richard confirmed. Companies with flexible work policies show higher employee engagement, lower turnover, and most importantly for this room, stronger financial performance over time. Martha Wellington nodded slowly. My daughter's firm implemented something similar last year. Their productivity increased 12%. Walter remained skeptical. This might work for mid-level employees, but leadership requires full commitment. The co-CEO model addresses that reality while allowing you personal time. Leadership should model the values we want throughout the organization, Richard countered. If I accept demotion because I refuse to neglect my child, what message does that send? That at Blackwood Capital, family commitments are career limiters. That personal well-being must be sacrificed for professional advancement? He leaned forward, his intensity quieting the room. I built this company from nothing. I've given it my blood, sweat, and tears, and too many years of my son's childhood. I'm not stepping aside. I'm evolving as a leader, and I'm proposing that Blackwood Capital evolve with me. Gregory exchanged glances with Walter, clearly thrown by Richard's counterproposal. They had expected either capitulation or resistance, not innovation. This is a lot to process, Eleanor said finally. Perhaps we should take some time to review these materials before making any decisions. Walter looked displeased, but nodded reluctantly. We'll reconvene next week after everyone has had a chance to study both proposals, Gregory's co-leadership model and Richard's flexibility initiative. As the meeting adjourned, Richard felt the precariousness of his position. He had bought time but not guaranteed victory. The battle for Blackwood Capital's future and his place in it was far from over. Gregory approached as Richard gathered his materials. Bold move, he said, his tone somewhere between admiration and annoyance. But Walter's right. This isn't a tech startup with beanbag chairs and ping-pong tables. Our clients expect traditional professionalism. Our clients expect results, Richard corrected. And they've been getting them, even with my new schedule. He met Gregory's gaze directly. Why are you pushing this, Greg? We built this place together. Something flickered in Gregory's eyes. Ambition, certainly, but also something else. Resentment, perhaps, since we did, Gregory agreed. And for 15 years, I've been the loyal lieutenant while you took the spotlight. Maybe it's time for a change. The honesty was refreshing, if painful. Richard had always known Gregory harbored ambitions, but he hadn't realized how deep the sense of being overshadowed ran. If it's recognition you want, we can address that without this boardroom coup, Richard offered. Gregory shook his head. It's not just recognition, it's opportunity. Blackwood Capital needs leadership that puts the company first, always the way you used to. The conversation was interrupted by Richard's phone. Ethan's name flashed on the screen. I need to take this, Richard said, stepping away. Of course you do, Gregory replied. The words weighted with judgment. Richard answered to find Ethan's excited voice. Dad, guess what? My fever's completely gone, and Mrs. Peterson let me build a fort in the living room with all the couch cushions. The simple joy in his son's voice provided instant perspective. Whatever happened with Blackwood Capital, this connection, this trust, this relationship was worth fighting for. That's awesome. Buddy, Richard replied, smiling despite the tension of the morning. I can't wait to see it. I'll be home for dinner just like I promised. As he hung up, Richard noticed Martha Wellington waiting nearby. That was quite a revelation in there, she said quietly. About your son, Richard nodded. Not something I planned to share, but it seemed necessary for context. It was. Martha hesitated, then continued. My husband was a partner at Winston and Strawn when our children were young. 60, 70-hour weeks were standard. He missed recitals, games, dinners, all the small moments that add up to a childhood. Her expression turned wistful. By the time he made managing partner and could finally afford to be present, our kids were grown and gone. Now he has grandchildren he barely knows because he never built those relationships. She met Richard's eyes. Don't make his mistake. I'll be reviewing your proposal carefully, and I suspect Eleanor will too. With that potential alliance identified, Richard returned to his office to plan his next moves. The week ahead would require careful navigation, securing board support, reassuring clients, and countering Gregory's maneuvering, all while maintaining his commitments to Ethan. As promised, Richard arrived home at 6 o'clock to find an elaborate blanket fort dominating the living room, complete with pillowed walls and string lights Mrs. Peterson had found in the holiday decorations. "Dad, come see," Ethan called, poking his head out of the fort's entrance. "It has a reading nook and a game station and even a snack bar." Richard dropped to his hands and knees, crawling inside to find a surprisingly spacious interior, furnished with cushions, books, and a carefully arranged plate of cookies. "This is incredible," he said, genuinely impressed. "You built all this today?" "Mrs. Peterson helped with the tall parts," Ethan admitted, "but I did the design." "Do you really like it?" "I love it," Richard assured him, settling onto a cushion. "Best fort I've ever seen." They spent the evening inside the fort, eating dinner picnic-style and playing board games by flashlight. Not once did Richard check his phone or email, though he knew his inbox was filling with reactions to the morning's meeting. As he tucked Ethan into bed later, the boy asked drowsily, "How was your big meeting?" Richard considered how to answer truthfully without burdening his son. "It was challenging," he said finally. "Some people at my company think I should work more and be home less." Ethan's eyes, heavy with sleep, opened wider. "Are you going to?" "No," Richard said firmly. "I'm trying to show them that I can be good at my job and still be your dad. It's taking some convincing." Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Is it because of me? Are you in trouble because you take care of me now?" The question broke Richard's heart. Even now, Ethan was internalizing adult problems, wondering if he was a burden. "It's not because of you," Richard assured him, stroking his hair. "There's because of me, because I'm changing how I work. Change is hard for everyone." He smiled reassuringly. "But don't worry. I've got a plan." After Ethan fell asleep, Richard retreated to his home office. His inbox contained what he expected: cautious support from Eleanor and Martha, skepticism from others, and a detailed critique from Walter, dismissing the flexibility proposal as impractical idealism. Most concerning was an email from Mark Harrison, the potential investor, requesting a private meeting with Gregory to discuss leadership stability at Blackwood Capital. Richard leaned back in his chair, contemplating his options. The Harrison investment was significant, but not make or break. Losing it would hurt quarterly projections, but wouldn't fundamentally threaten the company's stability. More dangerous was the narrative Gregory and Walter were crafting. Richard Blackwood had lost his edge, his commitment, his hunger. He had become soft, distracted, unreliable. Combating that perception would require more than proposals and presentations. It would require demonstrating that his new approach to leadership wasn't a compromise but an evolution, one that strengthened rather than weakened Blackwood Capital. Richard opened his laptop and began drafting emails to key clients and shareholders, explaining his vision for a more sustainable, human-centered Blackwood Capital, not apologizing for his new priorities, but framing them as forward-thinking leadership rather than personal accommodation. The battle lines were drawn. The next week would determine not just his future at Blackwood Capital, but the kind of father and man he was choosing to become. Continuemos como sexto capítulo. The week before the decisive board meeting unfolded like a high-stakes chess match. Each day brought new moves and counter-moves as Richard fought to maintain control of Blackwood Capital while honoring his commitments to Ethan. Monday's confrontation had made the battle lines clear. Gregory and Walter were actively lobbying for the co-CEO model, reaching out to board members and key shareholders. Richard, meanwhile, was building support for his workplace flexibility initiative, scheduling meetings around Ethan's school hours and his promise to be home for dinner. By Wednesday, Richard had secured tentative backing from Eleanor and Martha, with James Chen still undecided. The other 5 board members seemed to be leaning toward Gregory's proposal. If the vote happened today, Richard would likely lose. "Jennifer," he called through his open office door, "do we have the latest analysis on the Westbrook portfolio?" His assistant appeared with a folder. "Just completed this morning. And Gregory asked if you'd be joining the client dinner tonight with the Meridian team." Richard hesitated. The Meridian deal was crucial. A successful close would strengthen his position considerably. But tonight was Ethan's fall concert at school, where he would be playing piano in public for the first time. "I can't make dinner," Richard said finally. "I have a prior commitment." Jennifer nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Gregory mentioned he'd be happy to host if you couldn't attend." Of course he would. Every client interaction Richard missed was another opportunity for Gregory to position himself as the more dedicated leader. "Tell him I'll join for the pre-dinner meeting at 4, but need to leave by 5:30, Richard decided. "And please have a gift basket sent to the Meridian team's hotel with my regrets." The compromise wasn't ideal, but it balanced competing priorities. Richard would establish his involvement in the deal, while still making it to Ethan's concert. That afternoon, as the Meridian team filed into the conference room, Richard noticed Gregory's surprise at his presence. "Gentlemen," Richard greeted them warmly, "before we head to dinner, I wanted to personally walk through the final terms we're proposing." For the next 90 minutes, Richard demonstrated his complete command of the Meridian deal, anticipating questions, resolving concerns, and charming the clients with his strategic vision. By 5:15, they were nodding enthusiastically, clearly impressed. "We should wrap up," Richard said, checking his watch. "Gregory will continue the discussion over dinner, but I wanted to make sure we addressed your core concerns first." The Meridian CEO looked momentarily disappointed. "You're not joining us. I was hoping to hear more about your thoughts on the Asian market expansion." Gregory smoothly interjected. "Richard has a pressing personal matter, but I'm fully briefed on our Asian strategy and happy to continue the conversation." The slight emphasis on personal matter was subtle but unmistakable, implying that Richard was choosing family over their business. The client's brief frown suggested the message had registered. Richard felt a familiar pull, the urge to cancel on Ethan, to prove his dedication by staying. For 15 years, that pull had always won. Clients first. Business first. Everything else second. "Actually," Richard said, making a split-second decision, "I'm attending my son's piano concert tonight, his first public performance. As I'm sure you understand, some moments can't be rescheduled." The shift in the room was palpable. The Meridian CEO's expression softened. "My daughter plays violin. I've missed too many of her recitals myself." He nodded approvingly. "Please give your son my best wishes for a successful performance." As Richard gathered his materials, he caught Gregory's frustrated glance. The moment had backfired. Instead of appearing uncommitted, Richard had connected with the client on a human level. "I'll be available by phone later if any urgent questions arise," Richard assured the team as he departed. He made it to Ethan's school with 10 minutes to spare, slipping into the auditorium as parents settled into rows of uncomfortable folding chairs. Finding an empty seat near the front, Richard exhaled slowly, the tension of the workday beginning to dissolve. When Ethan walked onto the stage with the other third graders, his eyes scanned the audience anxiously. The moment he spotted Richard, his entire posture changed, shoulders relaxing, a small smile of relief replacing his worried expression. He had doubted his father would come. The realization struck Richard like a physical blow. How many times had Ethan looked for him in audiences before, only to find an empty seat? How many small disappointments had accumulated in his son's heart over the years? The simple piano piece Ethan played wasn't technically impressive, a basic melody with occasional wrong notes, but to Richard, it was the most important performance he'd ever attended. When it ended, he applauded wildly, earning an embarrassed but delighted smile from his son. After the concert, as families mingled in the school hallway, Ethan ran to Richard with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. "You came. You really came," he exclaimed, wrapping his arms around Richard's waist. "I promised I would," Richard reminded him, returning the hug. "You played beautifully," Ethan beamed. Mrs. Wilson said I was the most improved since September. He lowered his voice. I think it's because I can practice at home now. Cassandra never let me use the piano when you weren't there. She said it gave her a headache. Another casual revelation of past cruelty. Richard pushed down the familiar surge of guilt and anger, focusing instead on the present moment. Well, now you can practice any time you want, he assured Ethan, and I'll be at every concert from now on. As they walked toward the parking lot, Richard's phone buzzed with Gregory's name on the screen. He silenced it without answering. Whatever business emergency had arisen could wait until Ethan was in bed. That night, after tucking his son in with extra praise for his performance, Richard returned the call. Finally, Gregory answered, irritation evident in his tone. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I was at my son's concert, as I mentioned, Richard replied calmly. What's so urgent? Harrison called. He wants to meet with both of us tomorrow. Specifically asked for you to be there. Says he has concerns about the leadership situation at Blackwood Capital. Richard frowned. The Harrison investment was significant enough that the investor's opinion would carry weight with the board. What time? Noon, his office downtown. I'll be there. Richard paused, then added, just to be clear, Greg, are you pushing for this co-CEO arrangement because you genuinely believe it's best for the company, or because you want my job? The line went silent for a moment. Then Gregory sighed. Both, if I'm being honest. The company does need leadership that's fully committed. But yes, I've waited a long time for the top spot. The candor was almost refreshing. And if the board rejects both proposals, if they decide to maintain the current structure, then we go back to being partners, Gregory said, though his tone suggested he didn't consider this likely. But Richard, the momentum is shifting. Walter has James Chen almost convinced. Harrison could be the tipping point. After hanging up, Richard stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, lights twinkling in the darkness. The city never slept. Markets never rested. For most of his adult life, he had matched that relentless pace, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and ultimately his connection to his own child in pursuit of success. Now, with everything he'd built potentially slipping from his grasp, Richard found himself questioning not just his strategy for keeping control, but what control was worth. If maintaining his position at Blackwood Capital required returning to his old ways, the 16-hour days, the missed dinners, the broken promises to Ethan, was it really a victory worth winning? The next morning, Richard dropped Ethan at school with a reminder that Mrs. Peterson would pick him up. I have a big meeting that might run late, he explained, but I'll be home for dinner, I promise. Even if your meeting isn't finished, Ethan asked, his voice casual but his eyes serious. Even then, Richard confirmed, some things are non-negotiable. Richard arrived at Harrison Investments 15 minutes early, using the time to review the materials Jennifer had prepared. Mark Harrison was old money Chicago, his family's wealth stretching back to the stockyards and steel mills that had built the city. His investment would bring not just capital, but prestige to Blackwood Capital. Gregory arrived moments later, immaculately dressed and visibly tense. Walter called this morning, he murmured as they waited in Harrison's opulent reception area. He thinks today could determine everything. Before Richard could respond, Harrison's assistant led them into a corner office with sweeping views of Lake Michigan. Mark Harrison, silver-haired, golf-tanned, Brooks Brothers clad, rose to greet them with practiced cordiality. Richard, Gregory, thank you for coming. I've been following Blackwood Capital's performance with great interest. The meeting began with standard pleasantries and high-level discussion of investment strategy. Harrison was clearly knowledgeable and engaged, asking pointed questions that revealed his thorough research. After about 30 minutes, he set aside his notes and leaned back in his leather chair. Gentlemen, let me be direct. I'm prepared to make a significant investment in Blackwood Capital, but I have concerns about the current situation. Richard nodded. You're referring to the leadership discussion our board is having. Precisely. Harrison looked between them. Gregory has been quite open about the proposed co-CEO model, and I understand you have a counter-proposal involving workplace flexibility policies. I do, Richard confirmed. I believe Blackwood Capital can maintain its excellence while creating a more sustainable culture for all employees, starting with leadership. Harrison's expression remained neutral. An admirable sentiment, But in my experience, investment firms require singular, focused leadership, the kind of dedication that doesn't clock out at 5 for family dinner. The dismissive tone made Richard's jaw tighten. He was about to respond when his phone buzzed with a text. Normally he would ignore it during such a critical meeting, but something made him glance down. It was from Mrs. Peterson. Ethan, running high fever. School nurse called. 135, should I take him to doctor? Richard felt the room narrow to a pinpoint. Ethan, sick again, possibly the flu returning, which the doctor had warned could be dangerous. And here he sat in a meeting that could determine his professional future. Gregory noticed Richard's expression change. Everything all right? My son is ill, Richard said, already standing. I need to go. Harrison's eyebrows rose. Surely your housekeeper can handle a childhood fever. We're discussing a 9-figure investment. The old Richard would have agreed, would have texted instructions and continued the meeting. The new Richard didn't hesitate. My son's health isn't negotiable. Mr. Harrison, I apologize for the interruption, but I need to be with him. Gregory's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and opportunity. Richard, perhaps we should... You can continue the meeting, Richard told his partner, already moving toward the door. I trust you to represent the firm's interests. But I have to go, Harrison called after him. The board votes Monday, Richard. My recommendation carries significant weight. Walking out now sends a clear message about your priorities. Richard paused at the door, turning back to meet Harrison's gaze directly. Yes, it does, and I'm comfortable with that message. The drive to Ethan's school seemed interminable, though Chicago traffic was mercifully light in mid-afternoon. Richard's mind raced between concern for his son and awareness of what he'd just sacrificed. Harrison would almost certainly back Gregory now. The co-CEO proposal would likely pass on Monday, effectively ending Richard's control of the company he'd built. Yet as he pulled into the school parking lot, Richard felt something unexpected. Peace. Whatever came next professionally, he knew he was finally making the right choice. In the school nurse's office, he found Ethan curled on a cot, face flushed with fever. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief when Richard appeared. Dad? How did you get here so fast? Mrs. Peterson said she'd come. I left my meeting, Richard said simply, gathering Ethan and his backpack. Let's get you to the doctor. As they waited in the pediatrician's office, Ethan leaned against Richard's shoulder, dozing fitfully. Richard's phone vibrated constantly. Gregory, Walter, Jennifer all urgently seeking updates on the Harrison situation. Finally, he texted Jennifer, taking Ethan to doctor. We'll update later. Please reschedule anything critical. The doctor confirmed the flu had indeed returned, prescribing stronger antivirals and rest. He'll need close monitoring, she warned. If his fever goes above 103 again, go straight to the emergency room. By the time they arrived home, Ethan was asleep on his feet. Richard carried him upstairs and tucked him into bed, setting up a humidifier and placing water and medication on the nightstand. Only then did he call Gregory. How did it go with Harrison? He asked without preamble. Gregory's voice was tight, about as well as you'd expect after you walked out. He thanked me for my time and said he'd be in touch before Monday's vote. I'm sorry for putting you in that position, Richard said sincerely. Are you? Gregory challenged. Because from where I'm standing, you just torpedoed our biggest potential investment to play nurse. The accusation stung, but Richard recognized the fear beneath it. Gregory wasn't just ambitious. He was genuinely concerned about the company's future under what he perceived as Richard's divided leadership. My son has a dangerous case of flu, Richard explained calmly. The same illness that sent us to the emergency room last week. I made the only choice I could. Gregory was quiet for a moment. Walter already knows. He's called an emergency executive committee meeting for tomorrow morning. They're going to recommend the board approve my proposal on Monday. The news should have devastated Richard. Instead, he felt that same strange peace. Then I'll present my counter-argument on Monday. Richard, Gregory's voice softened slightly, I don't think you understand. It's over. Harrison was the last piece Walter needed. With his backing, they have the votes. Maybe, Richard conceded. But I'm not conceding before the vote. After hanging up, Richard checked on Ethan, relieved to find his fever holding steady. The boy stirred as Richard adjusted his blankets. "Dad?" he murmured drowsily. "Did you get in trouble for leaving your meeting?" Richard smoothed Ethan's hair from his forehead. "Let's just say some people at work are unhappy with me. Because of me." Ethan's voice was small, heavy with guilt that no child should carry. "Nobody. Because of the choices I'm making. Good choices, I think, even if they're difficult ones." Richard smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry about it. Just focus on getting better." Ethan nodded sleepily. "I'm glad you came instead of Mrs. Peterson." "Me too," Richard whispered, watching as his son drifted back to sleep. Throughout the night, Richard monitored Ethan's temperature, administered medication, and refreshed cool compresses. Between these duties, he worked on his presentation for Monday's board meeting, not with desperation but with clarity of purpose. By morning, Ethan's fever had broken, though he remained weak. Richard called Jennifer to clear his calendar for the day, ignoring the increasingly urgent messages from Walter and the board. "Dad?" Ethan asked as Richard brought him breakfast in bed. "Are you staying home again today?" "All day," Richard confirmed. "We can watch movies or read books or just rest, whatever you feel up to." Ethan's smile was tentative but real. "Can we build another fort? A bigger one this time?" And so, while the executive committee met without him to decide his professional fate, Richard Blackwood, founder of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm, financial wunderkind, and previously absentee father, spent the day constructing the world's most elaborate living room fort with his 8-year-old son. With every blanket hung, every cushion positioned, every string light carefully placed, he felt more certain that whatever Monday's vote revealed, he had already won the battle that truly mattered. Finalizando como sétimo capítulo. Monday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline Chicago autumn day that seemed designed for fresh starts and decisive endings. Richard adjusted his tie in the mirror, noting the subtle differences in his appearance since that fateful day 2 months ago. The perpetual tension around his eyes had softened. The permanent furrow between his brows had eased. He looked, despite everything at stake today, more at peace. Ethan watched from the doorway, still in pajamas but fully recovered from his illness. "Are you going to win today, Dad?" The innocent question encompassed so much. Richard knelt to his son's eye level. "I don't know, buddy, but I'm going to do my best. And no matter what happens, nothing changes between us. That's the most important thing." Ethan nodded solemnly. "If you lose your company, we'll still have enough money for food, right?" The question, revealing a child's lingering fear of hunger, squeezed Richard's heart. "We'll have plenty for food and everything else you need. I promise. Even if things change at work, we'll be fine." After dropping Ethan at school with an extra long hug, Richard drove downtown through rush-hour traffic, mentally rehearsing his presentation. Jennifer met him at the elevator with a sympathy coffee and the latest intelligence. The executive committee voted unanimously to recommend Gregory's proposal, she reported grimly. "Walter's been making calls all weekend." "Eleanor seems to be wavering." Richard nodded, unsurprised. "And Harrison?" "Confirmed his attendance at today's meeting. He'll be presenting his investment offer directly to the board, with conditions. Those conditions would almost certainly include the leadership change." Richard took a steadying breath. "Thank you, Jennifer, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," she replied with determined loyalty. "It's not over until the final vote." The board was already assembled when Richard entered the conference room, an ominous sign. Gregory sat near Walter, both men wearing expressions of controlled anticipation. Eleanor avoided Richard's eyes, confirming Jennifer's assessment of her wavering support. Martha Wellington offered a small, encouraging smile. James Chen looked deeply uncomfortable. The remaining board members, all aligned with Walter, regarded Richard with expressions ranging from sympathy to impatience. "Richard, thank you for joining us," Walter began with formal coldness. "As you know, we're here to resolve the leadership question. The executive committee has reviewed both proposals and recommends proceeding with the co-CEO model outlined by Gregory." Richard nodded calmly. "Before we move to a vote, I'd like to present some final thoughts." Walter glanced at his watch. "Mark Harrison will be joining us in 20 minutes to discuss his investment. We should conclude this matter before he arrives." The message was clear. They wanted this done quickly, without the messy complications of further debate. I'll be brief, Richard promised, distributing folders to each board member. What you're holding is not another proposal or set of performance metrics. It's something more personal. The board members exchanged puzzled glances as they opened the folders. Inside each was a single photograph, a candid shot of Ethan in the elaborate blanket fort they had built during his illness, his face alight with joy as he read a book by flashlight. "This is my son. Ethan," Richard said, his voice steady. 8 years old, gifted in science, learning piano, terrible at chess but improving, loves space exploration and chocolate ice cream. Afraid of thunderstorms but too proud to admit it. Walter shifted impatiently. "Richard, I'm not sure what this has to do with—" "Everything," Richard interrupted firmly. "This has everything to do with the decision before us today." He moved to the head of the table, commanding the room as he had countless times before, but now with a different kind of authority. 2 months ago, I discovered that while I was building Blackwood Capital into what it is today, my son was being neglected and emotionally abused in my own home. I was so focused on growing our assets under management that I failed to notice he was starving, literally searching through garbage for food. The blunt statement created a ripple of discomfort around the table. Even Walter had the grace to look momentarily chastened. "That moment changed everything for me," Richard continued. "Not just because it revealed a horrific situation that needed immediate correction, but because it forced me to confront a simple truth. I had succeeded as a businessman and failed as a human being." He looked directly at Gregory. "The co-CEO proposal assumes these two roles are incompatible, that being fully present for my son means I can't effectively lead this company. I reject that premise completely." Moving back to his seat, Richard continued, "For 15 years, I've defined success exclusively through Blackwood Capital's growth. More assets, more clients, more profit, and by those metrics we've been extraordinarily successful." Everyone nodded. "This, at least, was indisputable, but at what cost?" Richard asked quietly. "Not just to me or my son, but to everyone in this organization. How many of our employees have missed their children's milestones? How many marriages have frayed under the strain of our expectations? How many talented people have we lost because we forced them to choose between professional success and personal fulfillment?" Walter cleared his throat. "These are touching sentiments, Richard, but Blackwood Capital isn't a social experiment. We have fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders." "Indeed we do," Richard agreed, "which is why my workplace flexibility initiative isn't just morally right, it's strategically sound." He turned to the room. "The evidence is clear. Companies that prioritize employee well-being outperform their competitors in the long term. Lower turnover, higher engagement, greater innovation." "Our clients expect immediate responsiveness," Gregory objected. "They won't wait while we attend soccer games." "Our clients are people too," Richard countered, "with families and personal lives of their own. The Meridian CEO expressed more respect when I left for Ethan's concert than he ever did during our late-night strategy sessions." He looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. "I'm not asking to work less or care less about Blackwood Capital. I'm proposing we work smarter, with greater purpose and humanity. That we create a culture where success includes personal fulfillment, not just professional achievement." Martha Wellington nodded slowly. "My son works for a tech company with policies like these. He says productivity has never been higher." "Tech companies can experiment with these approaches," Walter dismissed. "Investment management requires discipline and tradition." "Does it?" Richard challenged. "Or is that just what we tell ourselves to justify the sacrifices we've normalized? I built this company on innovation, on questioning established practices. Why should our workplace culture be exempt from that same scrutiny?" Before Walter could respond, the conference room door opened. Mark Harrison entered, immaculately dressed and radiating the confident authority of old money. "Gentlemen, ladies," he greeted them, taking the empty seat beside Walter. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Walter assured him. "We were just concluding our discussion about leadership structure. The board was preparing to vote on the co-CEO proposal." Harrison nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Before you proceed, I'd like to share some thoughts that may be relevant to your decision." The room fell silent, all attention focused on the potential investor whose backing could determine the outcome. First, I want to be clear about my intentions, Harrison began. I'm prepared to invest $300 million in Blackwood Capital, contingent upon certain conditions. Gregory straightened almost imperceptibly. Walter nodded encouragingly. When we last met, Harrison continued, glancing at Richard, I was concerned about what I perceived as divided leadership. Mr. Blackwood left our meeting abruptly for a family emergency. Here it comes, Richard thought. The final nail in the coffin of his control. At the time I considered this unprofessional, Harrison admitted, but something about the incident troubled me. So I did some additional due diligence, not just on Blackwood Capital's financials, but on its people. He opened his briefcase and removed a document. I spoke with clients, employees, competitors. I reviewed performance before and after Mr. Blackwood modified his schedule, and I came to a conclusion that surprised me. The board members exchanged confused glances. This wasn't following the expected script. Blackwood Capital's greatest asset isn't its investment strategy or client roster, Harrison stated flatly. It's the culture Richard Blackwood has built, a culture that until recently demanded total sacrifice from its people without recognizing the cost of that demand. Richard stared at Harrison, genuinely stunned by this unexpected turn. My investment, Harrison continued, is contingent on Richard Blackwood remaining as CEO with full authority to implement his workplace flexibility initiative. The pronouncement landed like a thunderclap. Walter's mouth actually fell open. Gregory paled, visibly. But, sir, Walter sputtered, you yourself expressed concerns about divided leadership. I expressed concerns about leadership, period, Harrison corrected. After reflection, I believe Richard's approach represents the future of investment management, not its compromise. He turned to Richard. The man who recognized he was failing his son and had the courage to change course is precisely the leader I want managing my investment. Someone who understands that real success encompasses more than quarterly returns. The silence that followed was profound. Richard found himself momentarily speechless, the ground shifting beneath him once again, but this time in his favor. Eleanor was the first to recover. Well, this certainly introduces a new perspective to our deliberations. Indeed, Martha agreed, smiling openly now. Perhaps we should reconsider the executive committee's recommendation in light of Mr. Harrison's position. Walter looked as though he'd swallowed something sour. Gregory stared at the table, his carefully constructed plan crumbling before his eyes. I move that we vote on Richard's workplace flexibility initiative rather than the co-CEO proposal, James Chen said suddenly, finding his voice after remaining silent throughout the proceedings. Seconded, Martha added quickly. Walter, recognizing defeat, didn't bother to object. Very well. All in favor of adopting Richard Blackwood's workplace flexibility initiative and maintaining the current leadership structure. Raise your hand. One by one, hands rose around the table. Eleanor, Martha, James. Then the fourth board member, wavering but ultimately following Harrison's lead. Then the fifth, creating a majority that rendered the remaining votes moot. The motion passes, Walter announced with professional detachment that barely masked his disappointment. Richard will remain as CEO with full authority to implement the proposed changes. The remainder of the meeting passed in a blur of logistics and details. Harrison's investment would be finalized by week's end. The Workplace Flexibility Initiative would begin rolling out next month, starting with leadership and extending throughout the organization. As the board members filed out, Gregory approached Richard. His expression was a complex mixture of resentment and resignation. "Congratulations," he said stiffly. "Seems your gamble paid off." Richard studied his longtime partner, recognizing that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by these events. Trust broken, ambitions revealed. "We need to talk about what happens next," Richard said quietly. "For both of us." Gregory nodded, his gaze steady if not warm. "Yes, we do. But not today." After everyone had departed, Richard remained in the empty boardroom processing the unexpected victory. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "I heard." "Congratulations," he smiled, texting back. "Thanks. Could you clear my calendar for the afternoon? I'm picking up Ethan early." 30 minutes later, Richard waited outside Ethan's classroom, watching through the window as his son concentrated on a science experiment. small brow furrowed in concentration. When the bell rang and Ethan emerged to find his father waiting, his surprise was evident. "Dad, why are you here? Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Richard assured him, kneeling to his level. "I thought we could celebrate today." Ethan's eyes widened. "Does that mean you won? You get to keep your company?" "I did win," Richard confirmed. "But that's not really what we're celebrating." "What then?" Richard smiled, taking his son's hand as they walked toward the car. "We're celebrating new beginnings. For both of us." That afternoon they visited the planetarium, Ethan's favorite place in Chicago, followed by ice cream and a walk along the lakeshore. As the autumn sun cast long shadows across the water, Ethan skipped rocks with increasing confidence, each successful bounce across the surface earning a delighted laugh. Richard watched his son, seeing him truly for perhaps the first time, not as an obligation or responsibility, not as a problem to be solved or delegated, but as a complete person with his own joys, fears, and boundless potential. A miracle entrusted to his care. "Dad," Ethan asked, looking up from his rock skipping, "are you going to change your work again now that you won?" The question revealed his lingering insecurity, the fear that this attentive, present father might revert to the distant figure of before. "The only change," Richard replied, sitting on a nearby bench and patting the space beside him, "is that now other parents at Blackwood Capital will have the same opportunity I do, to be successful at work, without missing what matters most at home." Ethan considered this, then leaned against Richard's shoulder. "I like the new rules better." "Me too, buddy." "Me too." As they sat watching the lake, Richard's phone remained silent in his pocket, not because there weren't calls and messages waiting, but because he had finally learned to distinguish between what was urgent and what was important. The company would be there tomorrow. The board would adjust to the new reality. Gregory would either adapt to the changed dynamic or eventually leave to pursue his ambitions elsewhere. Clients would continue to demand excellence, and Blackwood Capital would continue to deliver it, but on more humane and sustainable terms. For now, there was just this moment, a father and son together on a bench watching the play of light across water, building the trust and connection that no corporate success could ever replace. That evening, as Richard tucked Ethan into bed, the boy asked drowsily, "Is everything really going to be okay now?" Richard smoothed the blanket around his son's shoulders. "There will always be challenges, buddy, at work, at school, in life. But yes, the most important things are going to be okay now. Promise?" Ethan murmured, eyes already closing. "Promise," Richard whispered, watching as his son drifted into peaceful sleep. Later, in his home office, Richard reviewed the implementation timeline for the Workplace Flexibility Initiative. The changes wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, skepticism, setbacks. Cultural transformation never followed a smooth path. But as he glanced at the photo of Ethan now framed on his desk, the same image he had shown the board, Richard felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had faced the hardest truth about himself and found the courage to change. The rest was just details. His phone buzzed with an email from Martha Wellington. "Congratulations again on today's outcome. My son's company is interested in hearing more about your initiative." "Perhaps a collaboration," Richard smiled, recognizing the doors that were opening rather than closing. The business world was changing, becoming more aware of the human cost of traditional success. Perhaps Blackwood Capital could help lead that transformation. He closed his laptop and turned off the office light, walking down the hallway to check on Ethan one last time. The boy slept soundly, one arm wrapped around the stuffed astronaut Richard had bought him at the planetarium. Standing in the doorway, Richard reflected on the journey of the past 2 months. From the shock of discovery to the painful confrontations, from the stumbling early attempts at parenting to the hard-won trust now growing between them, from the corporate battles to the unexpected alliance with Harrison that had preserved his leadership. Through it all, one truth had emerged with perfect clarity. The greatest investment he would ever make wasn't measured in dollars or market share, but in the moments of connection with the child sleeping peacefully before him. Richard closed Ethan's door softly and headed to his own room, ready for rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to live according to his redefined priorities. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly successful. Not because he had won the boardroom battle, but because he had finally recognized what winning really